Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And remember, this story is for educational purposes, demonstrating that silence is not submission. It is a loaded weapon waiting for the perfect moment. My name is Lillian. I am 32 years old, and for the past decade, I have operated in the absolute highest echelons of federal financial intelligence. I am a senior director of corporate crimes for a highly classified federal task force. I do not wear a badge, and I do not carry a weapon. My weapon of choice is a limitless, terrifying access to global banking mainframes and the absolute authority to freeze billions of dollars in illicit assets with a single keystroke. I dismantle corrupt multinational conglomerates, expose elite corporate embezzlement rings, and completely annihilate the careers of arrogant executives who believe their immense wealth makes them immune to consequences. But to Evelyn Harrow, the ruthless, deeply tyrannical senior managing director of Vanguard Global Holdings, I was nothing more than a pathetic, weak, mid-level financial analyst. I was currently working deep undercover at Vanguard to meticulously trace a massive $50 million offshore laundering scheme that federal authorities strongly suspected Evelyn was orchestrating. To maintain my absolute cover, I had to play the role of the quiet, unassuming subordinate. I wore cheap, sensible suits. I kept my head down. I allowed Evelyn to aggressively belittle my intelligence in front of the entire executive floor. She thrived on absolute dominance, ruling her massive corporate department through fear, intimidation, and extreme psychological abuse. She viewed any sign of personal weakness as a highly offensive corporate liability. And unfortunately for my physical body, I possessed a very real, very dangerous physical vulnerability. I suffer from a severe, highly unpredictable cardiac condition known as long QT syndrome. It is a rare electrical disorder of the heart that can cause sudden, chaotic, and potentially fatal arrhythmias without a single second of warning. To actively manage the terrifying risk, I wear a highly advanced, medical-grade biometric alert bracelet. It is directly synced to a specialized monitoring application on my encrypted phone, which instantly transmits my vital signs to an elite federal medical response team in real time. If my heart rhythm enters a fatal chaotic pattern, the bracelet physically shocks my wrist to alert me, and the phone automatically overrides local dispatch to send advanced EMTs directly to my precise GPS coordinates. The medical alert protocol was not an option, it was the absolute, non-negotiable lifeline that allowed me to operate in high-stress, dangerous corporate environments. The morning of the massive, highly anticipated, quarterly executive audit presentation began with a terrifying, silent warning. I was sitting in my modest cubicle, reviewing the final complex data projections, when a sharp, deeply uncomfortable fluttering sensation erupted in the very center of my chest. It felt as though a trapped bird was aggressively beating its wings against my ribcage. My biometric bracelet immediately vibrated sharply against my wrist. A bright red warning flashed across the face of my encrypted phone. My heart rhythm was actively degrading. The specialized federal medical team, monitoring me from Washington, D.C., instantly sent a highly urgent, Priority 1 medical advisory email directly to the Vanguard Corporate Health Office, explicitly mandating that I keep my medical alert devices physically on my person at all times due to an imminent risk of a severe cardiac event. The Corporate Health Office, following standard rigid bureaucratic procedure, immediately forwarded the urgent medical mandate directly to my direct supervisor, Evelyn Harrow. I took a slow, carefully measured breath, trying to artificially slow my racing pulse. I picked up my thick, heavy presentation binders and walked on unsteady legs toward the massive, glass-walled executive boardroom. My skin felt clammy, and a cold, terrifying sweat was beginning to form at the base of my neck. I knew I needed to sit quietly near the heavy double doors, keeping my phone completely visible and active. When I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, the air was instantly thick with intense corporate anxiety. A dozen senior executives, dressed in sharp, expensive bespoke suits, were already seated around the massive, highly polished mahogany table. At the very head of the table stood Evelyn Harrow. She was a tall, imposing woman who wore her tailored designer suits like physical armor. Her sharp, calculating eyes immediately locked onto me the absolute second I stepped into the room. I walked slowly toward the only empty leather chair near the exit, my hands trembling slightly as I set my heavy binders down. I placed my encrypted phone face-up on the polished wood, right next to my legal pad. Evelyn watched my actions with a look of pure, unadulterated, aggressive disgust. She marched down the length of the long mahogany table, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of her expensive designer heels echoing loudly like a ticking bomb. She stopped directly behind my chair, looming over me with an aura of suffocating, toxic authority. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Lillian?" Evelyn demanded, her voice cold, sharp, and dripping with absolute condescension. It carried easily across the massive room, instantly silencing the nervous chatter of the other senior executives. I looked up at her, my vision blurring just slightly at the absolute edges. My biometric monitor flagged a severe cardiac irregularity before the start of the business day. "Evelyn," I whispered, desperately trying to keep my voice steady despite the terrifying lack of oxygen reaching my brain. "The corporate medical office forwarded you the urgent federal advisory. I absolutely must keep my alert bracelet on, and my phone must remain completely active and visible on the table." Evelyn let out a sharp, deeply grating laugh that sounded like cracking ice. She crossed her arms over her chest, looking down at me as if I were a piece of disgusting trash she had found stuck to the bottom of her expensive shoe. "How incredibly convenient," Evelyn sneered, her voice entirely devoid of a single ounce of human empathy. "Your supposed mysterious heart condition decides to aggressively flare up on the exact morning of the most critical, high-stakes audit presentation of the entire fiscal year. It is truly remarkable how your absolute physical weakness always seems to perfectly align with the moments you are actually required to perform difficult labor. It is a documented, highly dangerous medical protocol, Evelyn," I said, my chest tightening painfully as the chaotic rhythm of my heart accelerated. "Medical accommodations are absolutely not special, optional privileges." Evelyn slammed her flat hand aggressively down onto the mahogany table, making several of the executives violently flinch. "I absolutely do not care about your pathetic fabricated excuses, Lillian," she snapped viciously. "I have explicitly watched you for the last 6 months. You constantly use this fake, invisible illness to avoid doing any actual substantial work. I received the corporate email, and I completely ignored it because I know exactly what you are doing. You are aggressively seeking attention, and you are trying to deliberately sabotage my presentation with your pathetic theatrics." She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at my encrypted phone. "This is a highly classified, totally secure executive boardroom. There are absolutely no personal devices allowed on the table. You are not going to sit here and text your little friends while I present the massive quarterly earnings. Hand over the phone, Lillian, and take off that ridiculous, bulky piece of plastic jewelry on your wrist." The sheer, staggering illegality of her aggressive demand hung heavily in the cold air of the boardroom. She was aggressively violating federal medical accommodation laws in front of a dozen senior witnesses. But the toxic culture she had so meticulously cultivated at Vanguard meant that absolutely no one dared to speak up. The executives simply stared down at their legal pads, too deeply terrified of her wrath to intervene. "Evelyn, if I remove the monitor, the emergency response protocol will completely disconnect," I pleaded, my voice growing thin and reedy as the oxygen deprivation worsened. "I could suffer a fatal episode without any warning." Evelyn leaned in incredibly close, her expensive perfume absolutely suffocating me. "Hand over the devices right now, Lillian, or you are officially terminated for gross insubordination. I will personally make absolutely sure you never work in the financial sector again." My fingers were trembling so violently I could barely manipulate the heavy metal clasp of the medical bracelet. Saying no felt entirely impossible because my undercover operation depended entirely on remaining inside the company. I desperately needed to secure the final, encrypted data files regarding her $50 million embezzlement, and those files were currently sitting on the secure server. If I was fired right now, months of grueling federal intelligence work would completely evaporate. I had to endure. I had to heavily rely on my own sheer willpower to survive the hour-long meeting. With shaking, clumsy fingers, I slowly unbuckled the thick, heavy biometric bracelet from my wrist. The immediate loss of the cool metal against my skin felt like a death sentence. I handed the bracelet and my encrypted phone to Evelyn. She snatched them aggressively from my trembling hands with a deeply triumphant, malicious smirk. She walked back to her position at the very head of the table, opened the heavy, locking drawer of the main presentation desk, and tossed my life-saving medical devices inside. She slammed the heavy wooden drawer shut with a loud, absolute finality. Now that the pathetic, dramatic theatrics are finally concluded, Evelyn announced loudly. Addressing the silent room of terrified executives, we will begin the official audit presentation. Lillian, I strongly expect you to take meticulous, perfect notes. If you miss a single detail, you will be staying here until midnight. The meeting commenced. Evelyn began to project complex financial flowcharts onto the massive screen, spinning a hypnotic, deeply fraudulent web of fabricated numbers designed to aggressively hide her massive offshore theft. I tried to focus on the projected numbers, but the massive, agonizing pressure in my chest was rapidly becoming entirely unbearable. My heart was no longer simply fluttering, it was violently vibrating, misfiring in rapid, chaotic succession. The edges of my vision began to close in, replaced by a creeping, terrifying darkness. The loud, buzzing sound of the overhead fluorescent lights completely drowned out the sound of Evelyn's arrogant, commanding voice. I desperately tried to speak. I tried to say the simple words, "I can't breathe," but my lungs simply refused to expand. No sound came out of my throat. The heavy pen slipped from my numb, tingling fingers and clattered loudly against the polished mahogany table. And then the entire world aggressively tilted sideways. My body simply gave out. I collapsed entirely out of the heavy leather chair. The right side of my face hit the hard, unforgiving tile floor of the boardroom with such extreme, violent force that my teeth aggressively clicked together. A sharp, agonizing burst of pain shot entirely through my jaw, but it was quickly swallowed by the terrifying, suffocating darkness that was aggressively pulling me under. For a few terrifying seconds, I was entirely paralyzed on the cold floor, unable to move a single muscle, but my hearing remained acutely, horribly sharp. A heavy leather chair scraped violently against the floor. Someone gasped in sheer shock. Then, an arrogant male executive sitting near the expansive windows actually laughed softly under his breath, deeply amused by the disruption. Everyone remained perfectly seated. Evelyn's voice aggressively cut through the sudden chaos of the room. Her tone was completely devoid of panic. It was laced heavily with pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Do not touch her, she is completely fine. She is just pretending." I lay there, my face pressed aggressively against the freezing tile, my fingers twitching helplessly toward the front of the massive room, where my life-saving phone and medical bracelet were locked tightly inside her heavy wooden drawer. Then a shaky, terrified voice broke the heavy corporate silence. It was Maya, a young junior analyst who had just joined the firm 2 weeks ago. "Mrs. Harrow," Maya's voice shook violently with genuine terror. She hit the floor incredibly hard, her eyes are rolling back. "Shouldn't we aggressively call 911 or get the building nurse?" Evelyn did not even bother to step out from behind the heavy presentation desk. She did not kneel to aggressively check my pulse. She simply looked down at my collapsed, dying body with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "I told you, Maya, she explicitly does this whenever she aggressively wants attention or wants to avoid doing actual work." Evelyn snapped viciously, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "Step completely over her if you have to, ignore the pathetic distraction, and focus entirely on the presentation." At that exact moment, a faint, rhythmic vibrating sound began to echo from inside Evelyn's locked desk drawer. It was my encrypted federal phone, The biometric application, having lost contact with my wrist monitor, had entered an automatic failsafe countdown. It was aggressively vibrating, preparing to override the local cellular networks. Evelyn looked down toward the irritating sound, coming from her drawer. She aggressively rolled her eyes, completely ignored it, and forcefully slammed her hand against the desk to command attention. I said, "Focus on the presentation," Evelyn demanded. But nobody was aggressively looking at the massive screen anymore. I could physically feel the heavy weight of their terrified eyes on my motionless body. They were deeply scared, extremely confused, and cowardly, waiting for the toxic authority figure to tell them exactly what reality was. And because Evelyn Harrow was the senior managing director, her incredibly cruel, fabricated version of events completely filled the massive room before my dying body could ever successfully contradict her. Maya suddenly stood up, her chair violently pushing backward. "Sit the hell down right now, Maya," Evelyn snapped violently. But Maya did not sit down. With tears actively streaming down her face, she completely ignored the direct order from the terrifying tyrant, turned on her heel, and aggressively ran out of the heavy glass doors, sprinting frantically down the long corporate hallway. The next 4 minutes were an agonizing blur of fading consciousness and terrifying suffocation. I was entirely trapped in my own failing body, listening to Evelyn coldly continue to present her fraudulent financial data while I lay dying less than 10 feet away from her designer shoes. Then, the loud, piercing wail of emergency sirens aggressively shattered the silence outside the massive corporate skyscraper. The heavy boardroom doors were violently thrown open. A highly trained federal EMT, dispatched directly by the automatic override on my encrypted phone, aggressively rushed into the room carrying a heavy trauma bag. He dropped violently to his knees as I sighed my motionless body. He quickly pressed 2 fingers aggressively against the carotid artery in my neck. His highly professional face instantly changed from focused concern to absolute terrifying urgency. "Patient is completely unresponsive." The EMT shouted aggressively into the heavy radio clipped to his shoulder. "I am entirely losing her pulse. We have a critical code blue in progress. I need the crash cart up here right now." He looked aggressively up from my pale face and locked eyes directly with Evelyn Harrow. "I am aggressively reporting this incident immediately," the EMT stated, his voice completely hard and entirely unforgiving. Evelyn's deeply tanned face went stark, terrifyingly white. Because somehow, this random emergency responder already deeply knew something that absolutely no one in that quiet boardroom had explicitly said. He knew exactly who I was, he knew exactly what my condition was, and he aggressively knew that this was not a simple fainting spell. "Clear this entire room right now," the EMT ordered aggressively, ripping open my cheap blouse to aggressively apply the cold, sticky defibrillator pads directly to my bare chest. Evelyn aggressively lifted both of her manicured hands in the air, actively acting as if the highly trained medical professional was completely overreacting to a minor inconvenience. "There is absolutely no need for this massive, dramatic disruption," Evelyn stated arrogantly. "I had the entire situation completely handled. She was perfectly conscious and fine a moment ago. She is absolutely not conscious right now," the EMT snapped aggressively, his hands moving with terrifying, rapid precision as he prepared the heavy electrical shock. He did not even bother to look up at her. Exactly how long was this patient lying on the hard floor? The dozen senior executives remained completely, cowardly silent. Then, from the open hallway, Maya's terrified voice cracked loudly. "She has been on the floor for several minutes." I aggressively told her we should call for medical help, but she refused to let us move. Evelyn turned sharply, her eyes flashing with pure unrestrained corporate malice. "Maya, that is absolutely not helpful, and you are aggressively jeopardizing your career." The building's head corporate nurse pushed aggressively through the crowded doorway, completely breathless from sprinting up 3 flights of stairs. She aggressively crouched near the heavy stretcher the EMTs had just wheeled in. Lillian has a highly documented, severe federal health plan, the nurse stated loudly, the words aggressively, cutting through the thick corporate tension of the boardroom. She is specifically supposed to keep her medical alert device completely close and active at all times. My eyes fluttered open for just a fraction of a second as the EMT aggressively prepared to shock my failing heart. It was just enough time for me to clearly see Evelyn's sharp jaw violently tighten as the terrifying realization finally hit her. She had aggressively confiscated a federal medical device. The heavy electrical shock from the defibrillator violently slammed into my chest. My entire body arched completely off the cold tile floor, and the boardroom was instantly swallowed by complete, total, absolute blackness, with view as FF, right text print, file created, the heavy, suffocating silence of the corporate boardroom was entirely shattered. The absolute moment, the stretcher wheels violently bumped over the threshold, aggressively carrying my lifeless body out into the hallway. Evelyn stood completely still behind the heavy mahogany desk. She aggressively adjusted the cuffs of her expensive designer jacket, attempting to quickly regain her iron-fisted control over the terrified room. She gets completely dramatic under intense pressure, Evelyn stated coldly to the silent executives, completely dismissing the horrific medical emergency they had just witnessed. She simply had a minor panic attack because she knew she was completely unprepared for the financial audit. Let us aggressively resume the meeting. She absolutely wasn't pretending. Maya's voice yelled aggressively from the open hallway. The entire executive floor went completely, terrifyingly silent. Evelyn aggressively faced the young, terrified analyst. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, dangerous slits. You need to be very, very careful about what you aggressively accuse a senior managing director of. Maya, you are dangerously close to being completely blacklisted from the entire financial sector. Maya looked aggressively down at her encrypted corporate phone. Her young hands were shaking violently. What Evelyn did not know, what no one in that massive room knew, was that Maya had aggressively hit the record button on her phone the absolute second my body hit the floor. And perfectly captured, in the upper right corner of that high-definition video, was Evelyn's heavy desk drawer, left slightly ajar, with my life-saving biometric bracelet clearly locked inside. While the screaming ambulance aggressively tore through the crowded Manhattan streets, actively fighting to keep my heart beating, the massive corporate machinery of Vanguard Global Holdings began to rapidly assemble a defensive wall. The highly anticipated audit presentation was immediately suspended. The remaining 12 senior executives were aggressively moved into the private executive library for immediate questioning. Mr. Bell, the imposing, deeply conservative CEO of Vanguard, stood aggressively near the heavy oak doors holding a thick, leather-bound clipboard. He was a man who aggressively prioritized corporate reputation over human life, and he was already actively preparing to entirely sweep the incident under the rug. Evelyn stood aggressively right beside him, her arms tightly folded across her chest, radiating an aura of complete, untouchable corporate immunity. We urgently need entirely accurate, factual statements, Mr. Bell stated loudly to the room of terrified executives. We absolutely will not tolerate malicious rumors or hysterical exaggerations. Corporate liability is currently on the line. Evelyn aggressively looked at the cowardly executives one by one, her cold eyes practically daring them to speak against her. And strongly remember, Evelyn added, her voice dripping with venomous warning, hysterical exaggerations can completely ruin promising careers. Maya aggressively leaned forward in her leather chair, entirely unfazed by the toxic threat. So can aggressively ignoring an employee who collapses and nearly dies on the floor. A few of the older executives actually turned their heads in shock at the blatant insubordination. Evelyn's face instantly hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Maya, Evelyn snapped aggressively, illegally recording a video during a highly classified executive audit is a massive, severe violation of your non-disclosure agreement. You are officially terminated, She absolutely wasn't cheating on an exam or stealing corporate secrets, Maya stated firmly, refusing to back down. She was aggressively dying on the floor while you laughed at her. She explicitly has a massive documented histories of aggressively seeking attention to avoid doing her job. Evelyn replied, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet library. The building's head corporate nurse aggressively stepped into the room from the open hallway. Lillian actively has a heavily documented federal-level health plan. Her biometric alert device was explicitly mandated to stay completely accessible if any severe symptoms appeared. Mr. Bell aggressively looked at his senior managing director. Evelyn, did you aggressively confiscate her encrypted phone and her medical bracelet? Evelyn's defensive answer came entirely too fast, slick with practiced corporate deceit. She aggressively gave them to me entirely voluntarily, Mr. Bell, both the phone and the bracelet. She explicitly stated they were an annoying distraction. I had absolutely no prior warning that this was a serious medical issue. At that exact moment, the corporate executive secretary aggressively entered the room. She was completely pale and aggressively holding a printed, time-stamped corporate communications log. Mr. Bell, the secretary said quietly, her hands shaking as she handed over the document. Lillian's specialized federal medical team aggressively sent an urgent Priority 1 corporate email before the start of the business day. The massive warning was explicitly marked urgent and forwarded directly to Evelyn Harrow's secure inbox. Evelyn aggressively blinked, maintaining her mask of innocence. I absolutely never received that email. A corporate server must have filtered it. Maya's thumb aggressively moved over her cracked phone screen. Across town, in the sterile, terrifyingly bright waiting area of the federal medical facility, my emergency contact, a highly trained federal agent posing as my mother, aggressively received a secure, encrypted message. Maya's high-definition video had just successfully bypassed the Vanguard corporate firewall. The federal agent aggressively pressed play once. The crystal-clear video explicitly showed my lifeless body, aggressively hitting the hard tile floor. It perfectly recorded Evelyn arrogantly telling the entire room of terrified executives that I was just pretending to avoid the audit. And most devastatingly, it aggressively zoomed in on the slightly open desk drawer, perfectly capturing my life-saving biometric bracelet locked securely inside. Minutes later, Mr. Bell aggressively watched the exact same video in the quiet corporate library. His grip violently tightened around the edges of the heavy tablet. The undeniable, brutal, visual evidence completely shattered Evelyn's fabricated narrative. He looked aggressively at Evelyn and stated, his voice completely devoid of warmth, "Why exactly did you lie and tell us the medical bracelet was never in your possession?" Evelyn was no longer standing aggressively beside the powerful CEO. She was quickly escorted into a small, windowless corporate conference room. The blinds were aggressively pulled down, and she was told to sit completely alone, while the Vanguard corporate legal team frantically requested the official EMT report to assess the massive legal liability. Back at the hospital, I slowly woke up to the steady, rhythmic beeping of a highly advanced cardiac monitor. The massive, crushing weight on my chest was slowly lifting, replaced by the dull, agonizing ache of the electrical burns from the defibrillator pads. My throat burned terribly from the emergency intubation tube they had aggressively removed. A senior cardiovascular specialist stood at the foot of my bed, aggressively reviewing my complex medical chart with my federal handler. The cardiac episode aggressively worsened and nearly became completely fatal explicitly because the emergency electrical treatment was severely delayed, the doctor explained, his voice thick with professional anger. Her biometric alert protocol should have aggressively triggered an immediate shock the second the arrhythmia started. But the device was physically removed from her body. My federal handler's hand aggressively tightened around the metal bed rail. So the advanced medical plan actively mattered, yes, the doctor replied grimly. And today, the aggressive interference with that plan almost cost her life. Back at the Vanguard corporate skyscraper, Mr. Bell aggressively reviewed the hallway security camera footage with the chief of corporate security. 6 massive cameras could not physically see inside the glass boardroom due to the electronic privacy frosting, but they explicitly showed enough to paint a horrifying picture of a corporate cover-up. The silent footage aggressively showed Maya bursting out of the room several minutes after I had violently hit the floor. It showed the panicked EMTs aggressively wheeling my lifeless body away on the heavy stretcher. Then, the footage explicitly showed Evelyn Harrow aggressively returning to the empty boardroom completely alone. "Pause that exact frame," Mr. Bell aggressively commanded, leaning closer to the glowing screen. On the high-definition video, Evelyn quickly opened her heavy desk drawer, aggressively removed a small, printed piece of paper, and walked rapidly toward the corner trash can. She aggressively went back into the room immediately after the ambulance left. The chief of security whispered in absolute disbelief. They aggressively marched down the hall and unlocked the empty boardroom. Inside the trash bin, aggressively shoved beneath a stack of used tissues, they found a torn, crumpled copy of the Priority 1 medical advisory email explicitly sent by my federal medical team. Directly in the upper right corner of the paper were Evelyn Harrow's aggressive, unmistakable initials, proving undeniably that she had received, read, and signed off on the urgent warning before she forced me to remove the bracelet. When Mr. Bell aggressively placed the crumpled, initialed email on the conference table in front of her, Evelyn stared at it in complete total silence. I aggressively panicked, Evelyn finally whispered, her arrogant facade completely shattering. "I made a minor mistake. You did not aggressively make a mistake, Evelyn, Mr. Bell stated coldly. You actively attempted to murder an employee, and then aggressively tried to destroy the corporate evidence." Before Evelyn could even aggressively attempt to formulate another lie, the heavy door to the conference room opened. But it was not the Vanguard corporate legal team that stepped inside. It was a team of highly armed, deeply terrifying federal agents wearing dark suits and earpieces. Because while Mr. Bell was aggressively worried about a massive corporate lawsuit, he had absolutely no idea that my federal task force had been actively monitoring the entire situation in real time. The aggressive removal of my biometric bracelet had triggered a massive, automatic federal response protocol. The lead federal agent aggressively stepped into the room and placed 3 specific items onto the table, directly in front of Evelyn. The torn, initialed medical email, Maya's high-definition video playing on a tablet, and a massive, 500-page federal indictment aggressively detailing Evelyn's $50 million offshore as embezzlement ring. Evelyn Harrow, the lead agent stated aggressively, his voice echoing like a final judgment. You are under immediate federal arrest for massive corporate wire fraud, severe medical endangerment, and the aggressive destruction of federal evidence. Evelyn stared at the massive stack of federal indictments as if they had spoken before she could even process the words. I didn't aggressively understand the severe reality of her condition, she stammered desperately. Your explicit initials are aggressively signed right here, the agent tapped the crumpled paper. And your massive offshore accounts have been completely, entirely frozen as of exactly 10 minutes ago. You have absolutely nothing left. The room stayed completely, terrifyingly silent. That was when the full, massive truth finally lined up for Evelyn. That morning, she had aggressively assumed I was just a pathetic, weak diversity hire trying to get out of doing hard work. She had aggressively assumed that her immense corporate power made her completely untouchable. When I aggressively collapsed, she had called it pretending, because publicly admitting I was severely sick meant aggressively admitting she had intentionally ignored a critical medical warning. But what she fundamentally failed to understand was the massive, terrifying scale of the trap she had blindly walked into. The EMT's aggressive radio call mattered because the federal dispatch already had my highly classified identity completely on record. He walked into that boardroom aggressively, knowing I wasn't just a random corporate analyst who fainted. I was a highly documented federal intelligence director actively running an undercover operation. That was exactly why he looked at Evelyn Harrow and aggressively stated, "I'm reporting this now." He wasn't reporting it to the corporate HR department. He was reporting it directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The spectacular, aggressive arrest of Evelyn Harrow should have been the absolute, final conclusion to her tyrannical reign. In a rational, functioning corporate ecosystem, a senior managing director being physically hauled out of a skyscraper in federal handcuffs would instantly trigger a massive internal purge. But Vanguard Global Holdings was not a rational ecosystem. It was a deeply corrupt, highly toxic financial machine entirely designed to fiercely protect its highest earners at the absolute expense of human collateral. Within exactly 48 hours of her deeply humiliating public arrest, Evelyn Harrow was aggressively released on a staggering $5 million cash bail. She did not use her own legitimate corporate salary to secure her freedom. She aggressively utilized a massive network of hidden offshore accounts, the exact same accounts my federal task force was actively investigating, to seamlessly wire the exorbitant funds directly to the federal courthouse. The moment she confidently walked out of the heavy federal holding facility, wearing her designer sunglasses and an immaculately tailored suit, Evelyn immediately launched a massive, aggressively coordinated legal counterattack. She was a woman who had spent 2 decades ruthlessly climbing the corporate ladder by completely destroying anyone who dared to stand in her way. She firmly, deeply believed that her immense financial wealth and her aggressive corporate connections made her fundamentally untouchable. She immediately hired the most ruthless, highly expensive corporate defense firm in Manhattan. A terrifying group of aggressive legal sharks known exclusively for systematically burying federal investigations in mountains of complex, impenetrable procedural paperwork. While I was still actively recovering in a highly secure, classified federal medical facility, slowly regaining my physical strength after the severe cardiac trauma, Evelyn aggressively called an emergency, highly classified meeting with the Vanguard Global Board of Directors. The emergency meeting was held in a completely secure off-site location, a massive, private club in the Upper East Side, where the corporate elite gathered to aggressively shield themselves from public scrutiny. Evelyn aggressively stood at the head of a massive mahogany table, completely surrounded by her aggressive defense attorneys and the cowardly, deeply corrupt members of the Vanguard board. This entire federal investigation is a massive, aggressively coordinated corporate sabotage, Evelyn stated loudly, her voice entirely devoid of the sheer panic she had displayed during her arrest. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand aggressively against the polished wood. Lillian is not a legitimate federal auditor. She is a highly aggressive corporate spy explicitly hired by our direct global competitors. She deliberately, aggressively orchestrated that entire pathetic medical episode to successfully steal highly classified corporate financial data from my secure executive desk drawer. Mr. Bell, the IMSU CEO of Vanguard, sat heavily in his leather chair, aggressively rubbing his temples. Evelyn, the federal agents aggressively possessed a highly detailed 500-page federal indictment regarding your offshore accounts. They explicitly found the torn medical advisory in your trash can. Maya's high-definition video explicitly shows you aggressively locking her medical device in your drawer. Evelyn let out a sharp, deeply arrogant laugh that echoed aggressively off the expensive wood paneling of the private club. Maya is a naive, incredibly weak junior analyst who was aggressively manipulated and heavily bribed by Lillian to record that highly illegal, completely staged video. I absolutely never saw that medical advisory. The entire document was aggressively forged and aggressively planted in my trash can by federal operatives who are desperately trying to aggressively seize my legitimate offshore assets. Her expensive lead defense attorney, a tall, aggressively imposing man named Harrison, smoothly stepped forward, completely taking over the narrative. We are aggressively filing a massive $50 million defamation and corporate espionage counterlawsuit against both Lillian and the federal task force, Harrison announced arrogantly. We will aggressively paint Lillian as a deeply unstable, highly manipulative corporate spy who aggressively weaponized a minor, completely manageable heart murmur to illegally steal proprietary corporate algorithms. We will aggressively subpoena Maya and aggressively destroy her credibility on the public stand. By the absolute time we are completely finished with our aggressive legal maneuvering, the federal authorities will be forcefully begging us to aggressively settle this massive case entirely out of court. Evelyn smiled aggressively, a deeply toxic, predatory expression stretching across her face. I want Lillian aggressively, utterly ruined. I want her completely bankrupted. I want her aggressively banned from ever working in the financial sector again. And I want Maya entirely destroyed for daring to aggressively cross me. The Vanguard Board of Directors, deeply terrified of Evelyn's aggressive threats and entirely complicit in her massive offshore embezzlement schemes, cowardly agreed to actively fund her massive legal defense using Vanguard corporate accounts. They aggressively decided to double down on their absolute corruption rather than actively attempt to clean house. But what Evelyn and the deeply corrupt Vanguard Board fundamentally failed to comprehend was that they were aggressively playing checkers while I was actively, meticulously executing a massive, multi-dimensional game of federal chess. From my highly secure, aggressively monitored recovery bed in the classified federal medical facility, I did not panic. I did not aggressively cry in sheer frustration. I simply opened my encrypted, military-grade laptop and aggressively initiated the second, highly devastating phase of my operation. I aggressively connected with my elite federal intelligence team. Stationed in Washington, D.C., I had successfully secured the final, fully encrypted data files regarding Evelyn's massive $50 million embezzlement explicitly during the chaotic moments before my severe cardiac collapse. The raw data was actively being aggressively decrypted by my specialized federal analysts. Director, my lead intelligence operative aggressively stated over the secure, encrypted channel. Evelyn Harrow has actively posted her massive $5 million bail. She is currently aggressively marshalling the entire Vanguard legal team to actively launch a massive, coordinated counter-lawsuit against you and the federal task force. She is aggressively attempting to completely bury the evidence. I took a slow, carefully measured breath, feeling the dull ache in my chest where the defibrillator had aggressively shocked my heart. Let her actively spend her stolen money on aggressive lawyers, I commanded smoothly, my voice completely cold and entirely focused. Let her aggressively build her pathetic paper fortress. We are completely shifting the operational strategy from aggressive federal prosecution to absolute, total corporate annihilation. I aggressively pulled up the complex, highly detailed financial flowcharts mapping Vanguard Global Holdings' entire corporate structure. The massive company was publicly traded, but it was heavily, aggressively leveraged. The deeply corrupt board of directors had actively taken out massive, high-interest offshore loans to aggressively fund their luxurious, extravagant corporate lifestyles and aggressively hide their massive quarterly losses. Initiate Operation Sentinel Protocol, I commanded aggressively into the secure channel. My intelligence operative paused for a fraction of a second, recognizing the massive, devastating severity of the direct order. Director, actively initiating the Sentinel Protocol will completely authorize the aggressive acquisition of massive amounts of toxic corporate debt. We will be actively seizing Vanguard entirely by force. That is exactly the aggressive point, I stated coldly. Evelyn aggressively believes her massive corporate power makes her completely immune to standard federal law. She actively believes she can comfortably hide behind expensive lawyers and corrupt executives. So, we are going to aggressively rip her entire corporate shield completely away from her. I want you to aggressively deploy our anonymous offshore shell companies. I want you to aggressively approach every single commercial lender, every private equity firm, and every single offshore bank that currently holds the massive, toxic debt of Vanguard Global Holdings. I aggressively typed a complex series of authorization codes into my encrypted laptop, instantly unlocking a massive, highly classified federal discretionary fund explicitly designed to aggressively dismantle international financial cartels. We are going to aggressively buy up every single promissory note, every highly leveraged asset, and every single margin call attached to the Vanguard Board of Directors and Evelyn Harrow. I dictated, my voice ringing with absolute crushing certainty. We will aggressively buy their massive debt at pennies on the dollar. And once we aggressively own the vast majority of their toxic financial liabilities, we will actively execute a massive, aggressive hostile corporate takeover. For the next 10 days, while Evelyn confidently strutted through the Vanguard corporate offices, aggressively threatening junior analyst and actively boasting about her massive impending legal victory, my federal task force aggressively went to work in the dark, silent shadows of the global economy. My elite team aggressively moved massive amounts of federal capital through 7 different, entirely anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. We aggressively approached the massive international banks that held Vanguard's high-risk corporate loans. The banks, deeply terrified by the sudden aggressive federal scrutiny surrounding Vanguard due to Evelyn's public arrest, were absolutely thrilled to aggressively offload their massive financial risk. They actively took our cash and sold us absolutely everything. We aggressively bought the massive mortgage on the Vanguard corporate skyscraper in Manhattan. We aggressively bought the high-interest loans funding the extravagant private jets used by the corrupt board of directors. We aggressively acquired the massive margin calls, actively threatening to entirely wipe out Evelyn's personal offshore portfolios. By the absolute time I was medically cleared to physically leave the highly secure federal facility, my anonymous shell companies actively possessed a massive, undeniable 85% controlling interest in all of Vanguard Global Holdings' outstanding corporate debt. I was no longer just a senior federal corporate auditor. I was legally the absolute majority owner of their entire corrupt corporate empire. The aggressive trap was perfectly, flawlessly constructed. Evelyn aggressively believed she was marching into a massive corporate boardroom to explicitly finalize my absolute destruction. She had absolutely no idea she was confidently walking directly into a financial slaughterhouse, entirely designed by the exact woman she had aggressively left to die on the floor. I drafted a highly formal, incredibly deceptive corporate communication. I did not explicitly send it from my federal email address. I actively routed it through the primary Cayman Islands shell company that now aggressively owned Vanguard's massive debt. The communication was aggressively addressed to Evelyn Harrow and the entire Vanguard board of directors. It formally stated that the primary majority creditor explicitly demanded an immediate, mandatory corporate restructuring meeting in the main Vanguard executive boardroom to actively discuss the massive outstanding debt obligations. Evelyn, deeply blinded by her own massive towering arrogance, actively assumed this mysterious meeting was simply a standard renegotiation with a new, aggressive offshore investor. She aggressively believed she could simply charm, manipulate, or heavily bribe the new creditor into completely backing her massive counterlawsuit against the federal government. She aggressively accepted the meeting. She actively instructed the entire board of directors to firmly attend, completely ready to aggressively display their unified, highly toxic corporate power. The morning of the massive, mandatory corporate restructuring meeting arrived with a heavy, deeply suffocating humidity that actively hung over the towering Manhattan skyline. I dressed impeccably in a tailored, completely flawless charcoal suit that radiated absolute, untouchable authority. My biometric alert bracelet was securely fastened around my wrist, glowing with a steady, perfectly healthy green light. I did not actively walk into the Vanguard corporate skyscraper through the standard employee entrance. I aggressively bypassed the massive, crowded lobby and explicitly used my newly acquired highest-level corporate security clearance to aggressively access the private executive elevator. Marcus, my terrifying chief legal officer and a former federal prosecutor who actively possessed a mind like a steel trap, stood perfectly still right beside me. He carried a heavy, reinforced leather briefcase containing the final devastating legal nails for the massive corporate coffins of Evelyn Harrow and her deeply corrupt board. The heavy elevator doors smoothly opened on the highest executive floor. The thick, expensive carpet aggressively muffled our footsteps as we walked purposefully down the long, opulent hallway toward the main glass boardroom. I could actively hear Evelyn's loud, deeply arrogant voice echoing aggressively through the heavy glass doors before I even reached them. We simply need to aggressively present a unified, highly confident front to this new offshore creditor. Evelyn was loudly dictating to the nervous, sweating board of directors. We will aggressively assure them that the federal investigation is nothing but a massive, fabricated misunderstanding heavily orchestrated by a disgruntled, pathetic former employee. We will aggressively offer them a highly lucrative, slightly elevated interest rate on the massive outstanding loans in active exchange for their explicit public support against the federal authorities. I have aggressively handled these types of easily manipulated investors 100 times before. They only aggressively care about cold, hard cash. Mr. Bell aggressively cleared his throat, his deep voice thick with lingering anxiety. Evelyn, this specific holding company actively acquired over 80% of our entire corporate debt in less than 10 days. That is not a standard investment strategy. That is a highly aggressive, deeply targeted, hostile acquisition. We absolutely must be extremely careful today. Do not actively be a pathetic coward, Richard. Evelyn aggressively snapped, her voice dripping with pure, toxic condescension. I am in absolute control of this corporate situation. I will aggressively bring this mysterious creditor firmly to heel within the first 10 minutes. I stopped aggressively directly in front of the heavy mahogany double doors. I took a slow, perfectly measured breath, letting the absolute crushing weight of my immense power completely settle over my shoulders. I was not the terrified, physically collapsing analyst who had aggressively hit this exact tile floor exactly 3 weeks ago. I was the absolute executioner. I reached out and aggressively pushed the heavy doors open. The massive, highly polished boardroom was perfectly arranged. The dozen senior executives were aggressively seated around the long mahogany table, looking incredibly tense and deeply uncomfortable. Evelyn Harrow aggressively stood at the very head of the table, wearing a striking, incredibly expensive crimson designer suit, actively projecting an aura of completely fabricated invincibility. Her high-priced lead defense attorney, Harrison, aggressively sat directly to her right, his thick legal briefcases stacked heavily on the table. The entire room aggressively turned to look at the massive doors as they swung open. When Evelyn aggressively saw my face, her confident, deeply arrogant smile instantly froze. The blood completely drained from her deeply tanned face, leaving her looking like a terrified, perfectly preserved corpse. Mr. Bell violently pushed his heavy leather chair backward, gasping loudly in absolute, profound shock. The corrupt executives actively stared at me, as if they were aggressively looking at a terrifying, vengeful ghost. Lillian? Evelyn aggressively stammered, her commanding, toxic voice instantly reducing to a weak, highly confused whisper. She aggressively blinked her eyes rapidly, actively trying to forcefully dislodge the impossible reality. Standing aggressively in her boardroom. I did not actively smile. I did not aggressively raise my voice. I simply walked slowly and deliberately down the entire length of the mahogany table. The sharp, highly measured clicking of my designer heels, aggressively cutting through the absolute, terrifying silence of the room. Marcus followed closely behind me, setting his heavy leather briefcase aggressively down on the polished wood. You are absolutely not supposed to aggressively be here. Evelyn finally managed to actively speak, her voice aggressively pitching up a nervous, highly erratic octave. You are actively under a massive $50 million defamation counter lawsuit. You are aggressively trespassing on private corporate property. I am aggressively calling building security right now to have you physically, forcefully removed. Evelyn aggressively reached for the heavy silver intercom, resting on the desk, her fingers trembling violently. I actively suggest you do not touch that intercom, Evelyn, I stated smoothly, my voice completely cold, even, and aggressively devoid of a single ounce of mercy. Unless you specifically want to aggressively, explicitly order them to forcefully pack up your personal belongings. Harrison, her expensive, aggressive defense attorney, immediately stood up, angrily buttoning his custom suit jacket. This is highly inappropriate and aggressively illegal. Harrison stated loudly, explicitly attempting to fiercely intimidate me with his imposing physical presence. My client is explicitly attending a highly classified, mandatory corporate restructuring meeting with Vanguard's primary majority creditor. You are aggressively interrupting a sensitive financial negotiation, and I will actively have you arrested for massive corporate espionage. I aggressively stopped walking, standing perfectly still, exactly where I had aggressively collapsed 3 weeks ago. I looked directly into Evelyn's wide, completely terrified eyes. I am completely aware of the mandatory restructuring meeting, Harrison, I stated softly, my voice echoing deeply in the quiet room. Because I am the one who aggressively called it, the absolute, profound silence that violently swallowed the massive boardroom was so incredibly deep that I could clearly hear the erratic, terrified breathing of the executive sitting closest to me. Evelyn actively sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting frantically between me and Marcus. The concept was so entirely foreign, so completely, fundamentally impossible for her towering arrogance to process, that her brain simply aggressively refused to accept the active information. That is aggressively impossible, Mr. Bell aggressively whispered, his face completely pale and shining with cold sweat. You are just a pathetic low-level financial analyst. You actively make less than $80,000 a year. You cannot aggressively be the primary majority creditor. You cannot aggressively own our massive corporate debt. I did not aggressively argue with him. I simply aggressively gestured to Marcus. Marcus perfectly popped the heavy brass latches on his leather briefcase. He aggressively pulled out a massive, highly official stack of certified federal financial documents and forcefully threw them directly onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy papers aggressively slid across the polished wood, explicitly stopping right in front of Evelyn and her deeply confused attorney. I am a senior director of corporate crimes for an elite federal intelligence task force, I explicitly stated, completely dropping my pathetic analyst cover forever. And while you were busy aggressively hiring expensive lawyers and aggressively hiding your stolen money in massive offshore accounts, my federal task force was aggressively executing a highly targeted, absolutely ruthless hostile takeover of this entire corrupt corporation. I pointed an aggressive, unwavering finger directly at the heavy stack of certified documents. Those physical papers clearly prove that my elite federal task force aggressively used a network of anonymous shell companies to actively purchase exactly 85% of Vanguard Global Holdings' massive, toxic outstanding debt, I explained, my voice explicitly leaving absolutely zero room for aggressive negotiation. We aggressively own the massive mortgage on this entire skyscraper. We aggressively own the highly leveraged assets actively funding your extravagant private jets. And most importantly, Evelyn, we aggressively, exclusively own every single massive margin call currently tied to your hidden, deeply illegal offshore portfolios. Harrison aggressively snatched the heavy documents from the table, his eyes darting frantically across the complex financial data. As the highly experienced corporate lawyer explicitly read the undeniable, terrifying federal proof of the massive hostile takeover, his arrogant posture completely collapsed. He looked aggressively up at Evelyn, completely realizing that she was not a powerful CEO he could aggressively defend, but a completely bankrupt, deeply toxic liability. You completely lied to me, Evelyn, Harrison aggressively hissed, forcefully throwing the documents back onto the table. You explicitly told me you had massive, legitimate liquid assets to actively fund this massive defense. You aggressively hid the fact that your entire portfolio was actively underwater and completely owned by federal shell companies. Harrison, please aggressively do something. Evelyn explicitly begged, her toxic facade entirely shattering as pure, unadulterated panic aggressively consumed her. They cannot aggressively do this. This is a massive illegal corporate ambush. It is not aggressively illegal, Evelyn, I corrected her with brutal, deeply cold Wall Street logic. It is an aggressive, hostile takeover via massive debt acquisition. It is a perfectly legal, highly aggressive financial strategy, frequently used by the very elite corporate institutions you deeply pretend to belong to. The fact that you do not aggressively understand the complex mechanics of how this explicitly works simply proves my exact point. You do not aggressively know how to legitimately generate true wealth. You only aggressively know how to systematically steal the money that other hardworking people bleed for. I aggressively stepped closer to the table, firmly resting my hands on the cool mahogany. I stared directly down at the deeply terrified, entirely broken woman who had aggressively mocked my dying body. When you aggressively confiscated my life-saving biometric bracelet and actively left me to die on this exact floor, you aggressively believed you were completely untouchable. I stated, my voice deeply resonant with absolute, final authority. You actively believed you held all the ultimate power because you controlled my pathetic corporate paycheck. But you completely, fundamentally failed to aggressively realize that true, massive power does not aggressively scream and throw pathetic tantrums in a boardroom. I aggressively leaned in, explicitly forcing her to look directly into my eyes. True power aggressively operates in absolute, terrifying silence, I explicitly whispered. And now, I aggressively own you entirely. Evelyn aggressively collapsed back into her heavy leather chair, entirely defeated. The sheer, massive reality of her total, absolute ruination had finally severed her last desperate thread of aggressive sanity. She knew her massive offshore accounts were completely frozen. She knew her aggressive corporate empire was entirely gone. She knew she was explicitly looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate wire fraud, severe medical endangerment, and the aggressive destruction of federal evidence. I aggressively stood up straight and explicitly addressed the entire room of terrified, highly corrupt executives. As the absolute primary majority creditor of this massive corporation, I aggressively announced, my voice echoing like a loud crack of thunder. I am officially, explicitly executing my legal right to call in every single massive outstanding debt immediately. Right now, this exact second, every single member of this deeply corrupt board of directors is officially terminated without severance. Your highly leveraged corporate assets are aggressively seized. And your private accounts are currently being entirely frozen by federal authorities across 3 different aggressive jurisdictions. Mr. Bell let out a loud, pathetic, deeply guttural sob, violently burying his face in his large hands as the absolute realization that he was completely destitute finally broke him. Get them aggressively out of my building, I explicitly commanded Marcus. The heavy mahogany doors were aggressively thrown open, and a massive team of highly armed federal agents explicitly poured into the room, aggressively placing Evelyn Harrow and the entire deeply corrupt Vanguard board of directors in heavy steel handcuffs. They were aggressively, physically hauled out of the massive skyscraper in front of hundreds of shocked corporate employees, their completely ruined, expensive suits explicitly dragging against the floor. 2 months later, I sat comfortably in the completely redesigned, highly expansive executive suite of what was formerly Vanguard Global Holdings. The deeply corrupt corporate entity had been aggressively dismantled, completely liquidated, and heavily reformed under the strict absolute guidance of my elite federal task force. I aggressively looked up as the heavy glass doors to my massive office explicitly opened. Maya, the incredibly brave junior analyst who had aggressively risked her entire career to record the terrifying video that saved my life, walked confidently into the room. She was no longer a terrified, heavily abused subordinate. I had explicitly promoted her to the prestigious position of Senior Director of Corporate Ethics and Compliance, a highly lucrative role she completely earned through her undeniable integrity. She smiled warmly, aggressively setting a thick, perfectly organized stack of new, highly legitimate financial reports aggressively on my expansive desk. The final offshore accounts have been completely repatriated, Lillian, Maya explicitly stated, her voice thick with professional pride. Evelyn's final expensive appeal was aggressively denied this morning. She is officially beginning her 20-year sentence. I aggressively nodded, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, glittering Manhattan skyline. I had aggressively taken the darkest, most terrifying moment of my entire life and entirely weaponized it to explicitly execute absolute, flawless justice. Arrogance and deep, toxic cruelty will actively blind, fundamentally corrupt people to the quiet, highly terrifying strength of those they constantly underestimate. When someone aggressively tries to forcefully manipulate your reality and deeply diminish your worth, the absolute best revenge is not an aggressive, explosive physical reaction, but massive, meticulous, absolutely flawless preparation. Immense financial independence and undeniable, terrifying proof are the ultimate, perfect weapons against massive toxic manipulation. The spectacular, deeply public boardroom raid was merely the explosive beginning of the most comprehensive, agonizing corporate dismantling in modern financial history. While the federal handcuffs explicitly secured Evelyn Harrow's wrists, the true, deeply profound devastation of her life was actively unfolding far beyond the glass walls of the Vanguard skyscraper. The federal asset seizure protocol, heavily guided by the massive debt acquisition my shell companies had aggressively executed, was aggressively unleashed with absolutely terrifying, microscopic precision. We did not simply freeze her primary bank accounts. We aggressively, meticulously ripped apart the very fabric of her deeply luxurious, entirely fraudulent existence. Exactly 3 days after the aggressive federal raid, Evelyn, temporarily released under heavy, suffocating house arrest while awaiting her massive federal trial, was forcefully evicted from her sprawling, incredibly expensive Hamptons estate. She was explicitly forced to aggressively stand on the immaculate, perfectly manicured lawn, heavily monitored by federal marshals, as a massive fleet of heavily armed repo agents and federal auditors actively stripped the multi-million-dollar property entirely bare. The massive, aggressively expensive custom furniture she had heavily boasted about in elite corporate circles was unceremoniously, aggressively hauled out and forcefully tossed into the backs of large, anonymous moving trucks. Her incredibly extensive collection of highly valuable, supposedly untouchable contemporary art pieces she had aggressively purchased explicitly using the massive offshore funds she stole from Vanguard, was aggressively catalogued, heavily tagged as federal evidence, and explicitly seized to aggressively pay back the massive corporate debt I actively owned. Her fleet of heavily customized luxury vehicles, including the pristine, aggressively expensive imported sports car she had aggressively driven to the Vanguard office the very morning she explicitly left me to die, was forcefully towed right out of her massive driveway. Evelyn Harrow, a woman who had spent 2 decades aggressively projecting an aura of completely untouchable, massive financial superiority, was physically forced to watch as the undeniable, completely tangible proof of her massive corruption was aggressively stripped entirely away from her. She aggressively screamed at the heavily armed federal marshals. She aggressively threatened them with her massive corporate connections. But her toxic, deeply arrogant voice entirely lacked its previous massive, terrifying power. Without her stolen, aggressive wealth to fiercely back up her massive threats, she was nothing but a deeply pathetic, completely broken woman throwing a massive, entirely useless tantrum on a heavily manicured lawn. The massive, aggressive destruction actively extended far beyond just Evelyn. Harrison, the highly expensive, deeply arrogant lead defense attorney, who had aggressively marched into my corporate boardroom, explicitly intending to fiercely intimidate me with massive, fabricated defamation lawsuits, found himself aggressively trapped in his own massive, terrifying legal nightmare. My elite federal intelligence task force did not aggressively ignore his massive complicity. During the exhaustive, highly meticulous decryption of Evelyn's massive offshore accounts. Some specialized federal analyst aggressively uncovered a deeply extensive, highly illegal paper trail, explicitly linking Harrison's prestigious law firm directly to the massive laundering operations of the Vanguard Board of Directors. He was not just actively defending deeply corrupt executives, he was actively facilitating their massive financial crimes by explicitly hiding their stolen funds behind complex, highly illegal attorney-client privilege structures. I explicitly authorized the immediate aggressive deployment of a massive, heavily armed federal strike team directly to Harrison's prestigious Manhattan law offices. The incredibly terrifying, highly public raid occurred during the peak hours of the busy corporate workday. Harrison was physically dragged out of his massive, deeply expensive corner office in heavy federal handcuffs, actively screaming about aggressive government overreach, as federal agents aggressively seized hundreds of heavily encrypted hard drives and deeply sensitive legal files. Within exactly 2 weeks, the deeply prestigious, incredibly expensive corporate defense firm was completely liquidated. Harrison was explicitly disbarred, deeply publicly humiliated, and heavily indicted on 57 massive counts of federal conspiracy, aggressive wire fraud, and massive financial money laundering. The terrifying, deeply arrogant legal shark who aggressively believed he could easily crush me with fabricated paperwork was entirely consumed by the massive federal leviathan I had aggressively unleashed upon him. The deeply corrupt, heavily complicit members of the Vanguard Board of Directors, including the deeply arrogant, toxically patriarchal CEO. Bell actively attempted to aggressively cut massive immunity deals with the federal prosecutors. They desperately turned on Evelyn like a pack of starving, heavily desperate animals, actively fighting to aggressively provide the federal government with deeply extensive, highly incriminating testimony, explicitly detailing her massive offshore embezzlement in exchange for slightly reduced prison sentences. But I explicitly ensured that absolutely no massive federal deals were aggressively struck. I aggressively utilized my absolute, terrifying power as the primary majority creditor to entirely block any aggressive corporate leniency. I explicitly mandated that the massive federal prosecutors fiercely pursue the absolute, entirely maximum sentences for every single heavily corrupt executive involved in the massive financial cover-up. Mr. Bell, a man who aggressively prioritized massive corporate reputation over human life, explicitly lost his entire massive financial empire, his deeply extensive social standing, and his highly expensive corporate freedom. He was completely bankrupted and explicitly sentenced to heavily serve 15 years in a massive, minimum security federal penitentiary. The massive, highly publicized federal trial of Evelyn Harrow was an absolute, completely spectacular media circus. The incredibly sensational, deeply horrifying details of the massive corporate embezzlement, deeply coupled with the terrifying, entirely recorded footage of her aggressively leaving a deeply sick employee to die on a boardroom floor, actively captivated the entire nation. Evelyn aggressively sat at the heavy defense table, completely stripped of her highly expensive designer suits and her massive, terrifying corporate aura. She explicitly wore a deeply unflattering, standard-issue beige prison uniform. Her deeply tanned face was incredibly hollow, completely devoid of the heavy, highly expensive cosmetic treatments she previously aggressively relied upon to fiercely project aggressive corporate youth and massive vitality. The absolute, completely devastating climax of the massive federal trial occurred when Maya was explicitly called to the heavy wooden witness stand. Maya, the incredibly brave, highly ethical junior analyst who had aggressively risked her entire massive corporate future to explicitly record the terrifying truth, actively sat in the witness box with absolute, terrifyingly calm composure. She was no longer deeply terrified of the massive, toxic corporate machine. She actively wore her new, highly prestigious title of Senior Director of Corporate Ethics proudly. A deeply tangible, heavily earned reward for her incredible, aggressive moral courage. The aggressive, highly desperate public defender assigned to explicitly represent Evelyn after her massive offshore assets were entirely frozen, actively attempted to aggressively discredit Maya. He aggressively suggested that Maya was heavily disgruntled, actively incompetent, and deeply jealous of Evelyn's massive corporate success. But Maya entirely refused to be aggressively rattled. Eyes aggressively watched her intentionally, explicitly leave a dying woman on the cold floor. Maya stated fiercely, her voice echoing aggressively and loudly throughout the completely packed, incredibly tense federal courtroom. Evelyn Harrow aggressively confiscated a highly documented, heavily necessary life-saving medical device. She aggressively locked it in her heavy desk drawer to actively punish an employee she deeply despised. And when Lillian aggressively collapsed, entirely unable to explicitly breathe, Evelyn aggressively instructed the entire massive room to explicitly step entirely over her body. She actively prioritized her massive, deeply fraudulent financial presentation over a human life. She is a entirely cold-blooded, massive corporate monster. The high-definition video Maya had aggressively recorded on her heavy encrypted phone was explicitly played loudly on the massive, high-definition screens in the federal courtroom. The completely silent, highly terrified jury actively watched as my lifeless body aggressively hit the cold tile floor. They actively listened, deeply horrified, as Evelyn's deeply arrogant, toxically condescending voice aggressively dismissed my massive, terrifying medical emergency as a pathetic, explicitly fake performance. And they aggressively gasped out loud when the massive, zoomed-in footage clearly, undeniably displayed my highly advanced, heavily necessary biometric medical bracelet explicitly locked inside the slightly open heavy wooden desk drawer. The aggressive visual evidence was undeniably absolute. It was entirely irrefutable. It was incredibly, violently devastating. Evelyn actively buried her completely hollow face deeply in her shaking hands, heavily sobbing loudly as the massive, highly undeniable truth of her completely toxic, entirely horrific actions was aggressively laid completely bare for the entire world to explicitly see. The heavy jury explicitly deliberated for absolutely less than exactly 2 hours. They actively returned a completely unanimous, heavily aggressive guilty verdict on absolutely every single massive federal charge. Evelyn Harrow was completely convicted of massive federal corporate wire fraud, severe, deeply intentional medical endangerment, massive international money laundering, and the highly aggressive, deeply explicit destruction of highly sensitive federal evidence. The severe, deeply unforgiving federal judge explicitly handed down an incredibly massive, entirely consecutive sentence of exactly 20 years in a highly secure, maximum security federal penitentiary. There was absolutely no possibility of aggressive early parole. There was absolutely no chance of a massive, heavily funded corporate appeal. Her entire life was actively over, 6 months after the incredibly explosive federal trial officially concluded. The massive corporate dust had entirely settled over the aggressively reformed Vanguard Global Holdings. The deeply toxic, heavily corrupt corporate culture that Evelyn and the deeply cowardly board of directors had aggressively cultivated was entirely eradicated. Under my explicit, heavily monitored guidance, the massive corporation was aggressively transformed into a deeply transparent, highly ethical, entirely fiercely compliant global financial institution. I aggressively stood alone in the massive, completely empty executive boardroom, explicitly looking thoughtfully down at the exact, heavily polished tile spot where I had violently collapsed exactly 1 year ago. The heavy, deeply traumatic memories still actively lingered in the massive room, but they no longer explicitly possessed any aggressive, terrifying power over me. The aggressive corporate tyrants who entirely believed their massive, heavily stolen wealth actively granted them absolute immunity were now aggressively rotting heavily in tiny, heavily secured concrete federal cells. The incredibly corrupt, deeply toxic executives who aggressively stood completely by and actively enabled the massive, terrifying abuse were completely bankrupt. their massive corporate reputations entirely, utterly destroyed. I aggressively touched the cool, heavily secure metal of the highly advanced biometric medical bracelet securely fastened around my right wrist. It actively pulsed with a steady, perfectly healthy, completely vibrant green light. When toxic, incredibly arrogant individuals aggressively attempt to forcefully crush you beneath the massive weight of their entirely fabricated, heavily corrupt corporate power, they deeply, fundamentally expect you to actively crumble. They actively expect aggressive, highly hysterical tears. They actively demand complete, total submission, but true, absolute power does not loudly announce its aggressive presence. It does not actively throw deeply pathetic, incredibly massive tantrums in heavy glass boardrooms. It deeply operates entirely in the absolute terrifying shadows. It aggressively gathers massive, undeniable, heavily encrypted evidence. It actively secures immense, completely undeniable leverage. And when the absolute, incredibly perfect moment finally arrives, it aggressively, completely, entirely annihilates the deeply toxic threat with absolutely zero aggressive hesitation and absolutely zero explicit mercy. I aggressively survived the incredibly toxic, deeply terrifying corporate environment that actively tried to completely destroy me. I explicitly took their massive, heavily stolen empire, and I aggressively made it entirely, completely my own, and I absolutely entirely promise you this. The incredibly profound, massive silence that heavily follows the complete, total destruction of your incredibly abusive, deeply toxic enemies is the most perfectly beautiful, heavily intoxicating sound in the entire world. The empire I systematically rebuilt from the ashes of Vanguard Global Holdings now actively stands as a towering, highly formidable monument to absolute resilience and uncompromising justice. We explicitly operate globally, aggressively protecting the highly vulnerable and ruthlessly exposing the deeply corrupt. Every single massive corporate entity that attempts to aggressively exploit its workforce or illegally hoard stolen wealth eventually finds itself actively staring down the barrel of our entirely unyielding federal investigations. We are the aggressive storm they never explicitly see coming until it is far too late. And as I aggressively walk through these massive, quiet halls today, I am profoundly, entirely at peace. The deeply terrifying ghosts of my past are completely, permanently buried, explicitly replaced by the cold, heavy, beautiful weight of absolute corporate dominance.